Namaskar, Sarni. Now I would like to introduce our distinguished guest and fellow Kashmiri Pandit, Padma Shri, Professor Amitabh Mattoo ji. Amitabh ji is a renowned thinker and author on international relations. He has been awarded Padma Shri for his excellence in education and public life. He has served in prestigious positions as advisor to the Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir and member of the National Knowledge Commission as an advisor to the Prime Minister. In 2002, Amitabh ji was appointed as the Vice Chancellor of Jammu University. Currently, he is a professor of disarmament studies at Jawaharlal University and honorary professor of international relations at the University of Melbourne. I can go on and on with the list. Like it's so many achievements and so many awards, but the time, like I have the time restrictions. So I would like to thank you, Amitabh ji, for being here. And I would say that thank you so much for giving us this, for accepting the invite and letting us have some insight of your journey. So you will be hosted, this conversation will be hosted by our own Urvashi, who is married to Anuj Tikku, and she is serving as a professor at Columbia University. Welcome, Dr. Mattoo. Urvashi, over to you.
I would probably like to take a minute, Amitabh ji. This is Archana here. Thank you so much for coming on this segment. And it is our pleasure and honor to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for having me.
It is our pleasure, really. Thank you. And Urvashi ji, are you on?
Oh, she was in, I think. Anilji, could you please?
I don't think she's on.
Yeah, I see her.
She should be on now. Yeah, she's the panelist now.
Thank you.
Urvashi?
I think I'm on now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Nidhi. And thank you, Dr. Mattoo, for spending some time with us. It's indeed an honor to have you at the KOA Forum. It's a personal privilege for me and an absolute pleasure to be in conversation with you. So welcome again. Let me start at the beginning. I know you spent your formative years in Srinagar, and some of us, a lot of us on the webinar have that in common with you. You went to school in Burnhall and you were there till the mid-80s. Some of us, some people in the community remember the early 80s and the years leading to early 80s as the good old days, when the vast majority of Kashmiris lived in a composite syncretic culture and Kashmiriyat was alive and well. And while some others in the community protest that Kashmiriyat really is a myth, it's a latter-day contrivance of the elite. And so, Dr. Mattoo, you've written extensively and quite eloquently on this topic. So I'm curious to know your thoughts. What was your experience growing up in Srinagar? And also, now that we have the benefit of hindsight, how do you remember those days? If we could start there and then go on.
Thank you, Professor Urvashi. And let me take 1 minute. Am I audible? Am I clear?
Yes.
Okay. Let me just take 30 seconds to first acknowledge the presence of some people that I know here, and of course the president of the KOO, Amitabh Mattoo, and Nidhi Kaulji, who is also the spouse of my childhood friend Sushil Kaulji, and I wish he was here as well because we went to Burnhall School together. I also noticed that Vijay Sazavalji is right in the left-hand corner of my gallery of images, so I want to acknowledge his presence. But more importantly, I want to thank all of you for inviting me to this segment. I'm really not a celebrity. I'm just a teacher, and teacher has to be a learner. And I can see Sushil there, so I'm waving to my childhood friend. So this is already...
It's been a long time, yeah? But you're the same. You're the same.
Thank you, Sushil. Very kind of you, and great to catch up.
Good to see you. Talk to you later.
Yeah. For me, the conversation...
Amitabh, it is good to see you. Namaskar.
Great. Sorry, I won't take more time in trying to acknowledge everyone else, but say what a profound honor it is for me to join the likes of Vijay Sazaval and your previous guest in part of this segment, I'm really a teacher, and I do not say it with any kind of false modesty, because a teacher really is someone who has to be constantly engaged with learning, with students. So, in other words, I'm also a learner. So, I have come here really to listen as much as to speak. And that's, I hope, going to be the genre of our conversation today. Urvashi, if I may take the liberty of calling you by your first name.
Absolutely. Yes, please.
Yeah, please. Yeah, you asked me this question. I'll not try and be too academic or try and use jargon uh, and to describe that experience. And yes, nostalgia can romanticize or can often demonize a period. But let me try and locate myself in that period, in the Kashmir. I was born in 1962. I went initially for a few years to Presentation Convent and then went to Burnhall School. Now, Burnhall was an unusual school, still remains an unusual school, but it was a school run by Irish missionaries. For most of that period, the principal of the school was a priest who came from Ireland. The teachers were mostly Kashmiri Pandits. I think, except for a few who taught Urdu or sports or maybe a couple of other subjects, by and large, they were Kashmiri Pandits or non Muslims. The class was mixed, and you had Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians. We began the day by saying the Lord's Prayer, and the principal, Father Jones, used to conduct this prayer. Uh, and everyone, our Father in heaven, and so on and so forth, said it with that same degree of respect and reverence, or irreverence, as you might like to call it, when you're about 12 and 13. But in some ways, you did not notice great differences. You accepted whatever was part of what you thought was schooling or growing up. I think later on, these differences became more crystallized. For instance, clearly in 71, when the India Pakistan war happened, I think there was obviously the empathy of the Pandits was completely with India, as happened with cricket matches. The empathy of the Kashmiri Pandits was always with with India. And you notice that there was a section which identified with Pakistan or with countries who are playing India, and that often created tension and often led to introspection. You recognized, however, that you were a minority, and that minority, however, was one which was extremely tolerant. I keep saying this, and I'll say this again. I can't find an example of any other minority living in such conflict and turbulent conditions, being 100% educated, materially relatively successful. I mean, no one was below the poverty line, uh, tolerant, non-violent, willing to accommodate different traditions and different cultures. So Kashmiri Pandits represented a beacon of light in Kashmir. So I must say that while uh, today I can think of instances where you were often called a dal batta, or where you were ridiculed because you were seen as being not as macho, or that your masculinity was not your foremost trait. But in those days, I did not see these differences as something which was dividing us. Uh, Obviously, I think intermarriage and interdining was also less. Intermarriage was almost unknown. Interdining was also less known. But the childhood was idyllic because we rode a cycle. There was no sense of fear. The atmosphere was beautiful. There was hardly any pollution. Um, and you went to school and you came back home, and life was simple. There was no internet, there were no mobile phones, there wasn't even a phone. We got our first fridge sometime much later. The first television set came only when the Asian Games came. So you really had to find your own devices to keep yourselves entertained. So those days, and I think if you were to ask, and I don't want to subvert this program, but if you were to ask my childhood friend Sushil, I think he'd come up with a similar answer that this childhood was idyllic. But however, I think what was different slightly was that most Kashmiri Pandits saw their future as outside Kashmir. Um, anyone who they thought that the valley was far too small in some ways to accommodate the aspirations of the Pandits, and any parent who had the means would send their children outside the state to study and get a good education and encourage them to find opportunities within India. So that was a growing trend. So let me not just kind of dilate on this, but I tell you that in a sense, it's not all romantic, but by and large, it was a peaceful, calm childhood, much less stressful than the kind of experiences that my children had to go through in a place like Delhi, for instance.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I when I look back on my childhood in Kashmir, I mean, I went to Presentation Convent, which was like a sister school sort of to Burn Hall, and I remember your principal used to come to our chapel every morning for prayers, and our Sister John, I think, was our principal, and so I do remember passing Burn Hall School every morning, and I agree that they were idyllic. It, to a certain extent, was an idyllic childhood, absolutely. And I also, like, you remember the cricket matches and the processions after the matches. So yeah, it does. When you were talking, it did take me back a while to my childhood as well. I think I agree that we all have shared experiences in that way. So I next wanted to shift gears a little bit. I know that since I have the fortune of having you here, you are among the very, very few people that can bring an academic perspective, expertise in international relations, conflict resolution, as well a policy lens to the issues related to Kashmir, right? And having been born and raised there, and you were just enumerating some of your experiences, your insights, I think, are even more meaningful. So I have to speak to you about one of the most important developments vis-a-vis Kashmir in the recent history, which has been the abrogation of Article 370. And I have like a two-part question. So part one really refers to an interview I believe you gave to Elizabeth Roche in the Mint, for the Mint in 2019. It was, you highlighted two salient points that were interesting to me. One was, and I quote, that the battle for doing away with 370 was easy. The battle for the hearts and minds of people is a larger war to be won. And the second point, which resonated with me personally, was that it's not a real estate issue. It's about the welfare of the people, and that was being compromised by a false sense of autonomy, right? And in fact, you so much as kind of provided a roadmap for the government. And so, Dr. Mattoo, I wanted to hear your thoughts. Like, do you still believe that New Delhi is on the right track?
I mean, I what we need to see is what will happen over the next few months and within this year. I still hold on to that point of view. I don't believe in Manichaeanism, which is a Chinese phrase of looking at life and looking at the world as being divided between God and the devil. The whole idea of conflict resolution is really, as you know, Urvashi, to try and put yourself in the position of the other. Mm-hmm. Why is he acting? If he's acting unreasonably, there must be, unless you view it in Hobbesian terms as life being nasty, solitary, short, and brutish. But I have generally a positive view of individuals. I believe that humans are born without any sense of deep evil, and that societies nurture them in a certain way, and that's what creates differences and often contest, competition, and conflict. So, as someone who academically looks at these through the prism of conflict resolution, I often take a more empathetic view, and I can understand that often people who have been victimized and who have been targets of deep suffering cannot take that dispassionate view. To expect a person who has seen deep suffering, or a father or a mother being killed, or a child being kidnapped, to expect him to have the same degree of emotional clinicalness about events in Kashmir is not possible. But I was trained as an academic, and that unfortunately is a burden that I have to bear, or a cross that I have to wear all the time. So I do look at 370 is not really important for me. I mean, 370 is really a restructuring of federal relations in the United States of America, where most of you belong. After all, there is always a contest between federal and state issues about jurisdiction, I mean, that's why lawyers have a field day in America. So that's in any federal polity. You'll have a contestation about whether it's about gun laws or social issues or any issue, and it will always be competition, and often you'll have the courts adjudicate. In this case, the BJP since 1953 wanted 370 revoked. They got the majority, they revoked it. 370 had lost most of its potency in any case. Most of the laws of the Indian had been applied. However, there were issues like gender empowerment or gender discrimination, which have been done away with. But I genuinely believe that the idea of India is one of accommodation, of pluralism, of diversity. And that's how it's different from the idea of Pakistan, which is built on bigotry, which is built on a narrow view of nationalism, and which what you witness in Afghanistan today is a consequence of this narrow, bigoted, sectarian view of nationalism. And the idea of India is really an idea that you celebrate diversity. You celebrate diversity and you celebrate differences, and you think that you can live and prosper and actually generate hope and optimism and economic growth and opportunities for everyone, even while you celebrate this. This is not a weakness. Diversity is not a weakness. Diversity is a strength. And that's what distinguishes India in some ways. That's the idea of Indian exceptionalism, much more than American exceptionalism, I often argue academically. So in some ways, I think the Kashmiris, how they are mainstreamed into belonging to India is a challenge. You could have, there were two clear models. One was give them a sense of autonomy and then they will identify with India, or you integrate the state and then they will initially be forced, but over time organically become part of the mainstream of India. The second experiment is the one which is going on. I think what you need to do is to make the people in Jammu and Kashmir believe that the robustness of Indian democracy, the robustness of Indian civil society, and the robustness of the market economy that has really helped take India to where it is today is going to be witnessed even in Jammu and Kashmir. That is the challenge, to get investment, to get different groups debating issues without ever resorting to violence, even with this integrationist framework. So I believe that it is possible to do so. 370 is really a bogey. It doesn't matter to me in any case. It's a resetting of federal relations. The central government could do it. It's done it. It had actually, it was part of its manifesto for a long time. But I still think that it is possible not only to reclaim that idea of diversity, and really Kashmiriyat for me is something which is may have been a political slogan. It doesn't matter what Kashmiriyat means. What really matters is whether Hindus and Muslims can live together. Now, the question is, 150 million Muslims are there in India. There is no other choice but to live together. I agree. There hasn't to be appeasement of any one community. There hasn't to be any favoritism or nepotistic backing of any community. But everyone has to have a stakeholding within this large cake that India represents, or the large cake that Jammu and Kashmir might have, so that they feel that they're part of this system which will provide them with the opportunities which you can lead a good life.
Absolutely. I mean, I got onto 2 points when you were speaking about this. One is that, it's a matter of the reality is shifting, and also a matter of perception that has to shift. And in conflict resolution, perception matters as much as the reality does, as you rightly put. And the other point that I gravitated towards is absolutely, I think diversity is indeed a strength. And to the extent that I believe that it is that secret sauce that keeps India united and democratic, and hopefully, we'll do the same for Jammu and Kashmir as well. So yeah, thank you for your thoughts.
She could interrupt you. I thought I'll interrupt you with a 1 minute intervention.
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah, the American dream was initially built on the whole idea of a melting pot. Mm-hmm. Everyone who comes to America comes from Ukraine or Europe or different parts of Asia and Africa later, and they kind of shelve their identities and become even changing their names to a more localized version. and they become part of the American dream, and they're all homogenized. But even now, America realized that that melting pot, that soup that was they thought they would be able to create, is perhaps less healthy as a way of building a society and building a dream than a salad bowl, which is for a healthy from every point of view, but also you see that everything that goes into a salad bowl retains that identity, retains that freshness, and yet contributes to a more wholesome, healthy meal. So I think that salad bowl approach of every identity retaining a certain part of their identity, even while being part of a larger dream, is what is important. And America, that's why it's so important to think of America as, in many ways, as a model as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So the other related question I had to 370 is that many in the Kashmiri Pandit community viewed the repeal of Article 370 as a positive development. Now that it's been a couple of years, the initial reactions have settled somewhat. I would love to hear your thoughts on how you see it impacting the community, or what the implications might be for the community in the near term as well as the long run.
I think psychologically, for most of the Kashmiri Pandits, doing away with 370 suggests that, look, India is now claiming its identity in a much more forceful way. Its imprimatur on the valley and in Jammu is going to be greater. And that psychological sense of support is important to a minority community which has been victimized, and in the 90s particularly had to flee the valley when they were faced with extreme violence. And so if that has served as a reassurance, I think there can be no better time for the Kashmiri Pandits now to come back and invest. Invest in living there, invest in building facilities, invest in reclaiming their sites of pilgrimage or their cultural icons, because you will never have a perfect situation. What you have today is that the security situation is in control. I lived in Srinagar last year for about 4 or 5 months, largely as one of the only benefits of the COVID pandemic, because I couldn't move out. But what you can see is that the security situation on the ground has been better than it's ever been since the late 80s, early 90s. What you don't have is a corresponding improvement in infrastructure. The whole idea of creating a Davos-like atmosphere hasn't happened. And that's where a minority which is so professionally successful, which is so adaptable, and which has the capacity to provide leadership, like the Kashmiri Pandits, must invest in the Kashmir that they want to develop in the future. After all, Kashmir is part of the imagination of every Kashmiri Pandit. There is an opportunity to build a Kashmir of your imagination, rather than actually look at the state. The state can be only a guarantor of law and order and security, but you have the right to buy property or take it on lease, even if you're not a domicile there, but take land, build. Why do you need a state to build a township? If the Kashmiri Pandits Overseas Association were to do it, and as in the famous phrase that if all of us were to work together in one single direction, we wouldn't have lost that cow. That's the old kind of Laldat phrase, that if we act together, work together, and unitedly pull in one direction, it's possible to actually create the conditions for us going back and creating a Kashmir that is of deep value to us. Doesn't mean that everyone has to go and settle there, but if you want to create a Jerusalem in Kashmir, metaphorically, then that's the kind, in a William Blake kind of sense. William Blake wrote this great poem which said that I want to create Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. Similarly, if you want to create Jerusalem in Kashmir's green and pleasant land, here is an opportunity to do so. And here's an opportunity for a forum like Kashmir Overseas Association to actually work, put tangible action on the ground. I promise you, there is an opportunity there. I'm not selling a false dream. There is a window there. I don't know how long this window will remain open, because after all, the greatest stakeholders, if they do not make use of this opportunity, the others will be more reluctant. We belong there. We have our cultural icons there. We have everything that is important to us was there in the valley. It's time we reclaim that.
That's on another optimistic note. I will share. In my optimistic moments, I would definitely agree with you, and I hope that what you just said pans out, and we have the ability to do that. I want to squeeze in a couple more questions. I'm not sure how we're doing time wise. One question I wanted to definitely seek your advice on is, and that's something that a lot of people on this webinar would appreciate, I'm sure, is that what can we, those of us in the diaspora, do to revive and actually preserve our culture?
You know, I think you have to recognize that diaspora, as small as the Kashmiri Pandits, less than 500,000 or maybe even perhaps 1 million at most, can only survive if it preserves its cultural identity, its cultural mores, its practices in some shape or form. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the best way to do it is territorially. You have a physical space where you can actually create those conditions. Mm-hmm. Ideally, begin by even creating a museum or a heritage center of Kashmiri Pandits in the valley. One of the things that's going to be lost is also all the personal papers, all the traditions. I mean, there is a internet or application that's been just developed called Ikwat, which I think tries to record some of that cultural iconography, but it requires much more than that. It requires for all of us collectively to have an oral memory, personal papers, from Zatuks to Jantris to all sorts of material which we think is, as you as a academic Urushi would know the importance anthropologically of almost a letter that a father wrote to his daughter from Srinagar when she was studying outside in J&K, because it conveys so much and mm-hmm. is so important when you are documenting that history. I think you need to do that as a first step. Create a center of heritage in the valley, ideally, but if not, somewhere else, and digitally, seamlessly connected to a cloud application somewhere, so that even if you don't go physically to that museum, you can at least get access to it through the new possibilities that technology and artificial intelligence offers us.
I think that's thank you. That's a very concrete step that we can actually take. You know, in terms of having a record, if you will, or at least for posterity. Is there something else that we in the US, you see us doing in our day-to-day or family lives, or, you know, the way that we, I don't know, interact with our children or the families or more culturally?
Yeah, I experienced this personally because my children are in Australia and one of them is in New York. So they can't speak Kashmiri, for instance. And then there was someone, Radhika Kaul, who an anthropologist, I think, from California, who did these classes, and she learned, but my children learned a bit of, or one of my daughters learned a bit of Kashmiri. I think much more should be done by promoting Kashmiri language, because language is one, if we lose control of our language, I don't know how many in this audience know Kashmiri. Saricha, agar bu kashir pit ka
Anmara sorry kashir
cha yaad kashir ya no in
बिल्कुल यार करांती से याद मुझे याद मुझे पता वो वाली क्या गए मगर मुझे याद
brought kun kya gets.
I think this is project Kashmiri language. I think this is the one direct way. Cuisine is going to be preserved because we will enjoy our food and it will be preserved. Our dress is going to be preserved, but language preservation is the most important and most difficult task. Yeah. Because people lose their languages in a generation. My children have lost it in a generation. I feel that loss deeply because there are some cultural sensibilities that you can never communicate in another language. Can you have a word for kaik in any other language?
No.
Yeah, words like Gurk or lol, I don't see any other in any other languages. And I do agree that, you know, language also carries the culture. It's kind of a medium that helps carry forward the culture, and absolutely language is key. And I know there like you mentioned, there have been some attempts, but absolutely. And organizations like KOA can play a major role in that as well. Absolutely agreed with you.
Just I know you're running out of time, but just
no, it's okay. Please feel free.
I was going to say that one thing that I do in a small micro sense, it's really micro, is that because our family has a house in Kashmir, and so we're going to set up a writer in residence, or I mean, we're toying with this from a family trust, and so that people can spend time in residence. And my mother is a writer, and she's becoming older and older, but she's written on Laldet, and she's just produced a book of 4 mystical poets. But so we want some young people to come and spend a couple of months in the summer, conditions permitting, and sit there in relatively idyllic surroundings in Srinagar, and we'll cover the economy from within India, plus all the boarding and lodging within Kashmir, to just for a person to reflect, write, and immerse yourself in a kind of anthropological sense.
That's an amazing idea.
Wonderful.
I'm very happy to work with the KO in seeing if this can.
Thank you. Thank you. That is amazing. I mean, it could be like a summer internship for our, students, so that the younger generation becomes more engaged, involved, and knows about Kashmir Valley and such, because I mean they have not had an opportunity visit. We remember the valley from our, of course, memories, but they will never be able to know that. And so if this is an opportunity, of course, it would be a great thing for KOA to start the summer internships if we have some resources that which can, basically would be a safe place for them to stay and then kind of research the valley. That would be wonderful.
Yeah. And I'm also aware of a couple of other, in fact, my aunt, Dr. Mattoo, you know her. So she also is looking to start a similar scholarship-based program where people can actually go in the valley. So there may be, some connections here that are possible. And I'm delighted that, this conversation led to some of the more practical outcomes. So it is wonderful to hear that.
Formidable intellectual, and Professor Shaktiban. And there's a cousin of mine who runs a DPS school there, who also knows your aunt. So we could use even some of the facilities of the DPS.
Excellent. Excellent idea.
Absolutely.
We'll have to take it offline, Urushi and Amitabh ji.
Absolutely.
Because the one thing, however, I'll suggest to you is that perfection is not something that we can achieve. You can't have a perfect situation where it's going to be suddenly Switzerland and then you can send your children to Lausanne or Bern or Geneva. That's never going to happen. You'll have to live with the imperfect Kashmir or a work in progress. But all I can ensure personally is that whoever comes will make sure that they're comfortable, not in 5-star luxury, but they will have an experience that they will remember positively when they.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So, while I have you here, and I think we have a few more minutes I can squeeze out, it would be negligent for me not to ask you about the Quad. I know you've been pining on it very recently as the attempt to build a 4-way strategic alliance between India, US, Japan, and Australia, which many international relations experts have labeled as a counter to China. But how do you view the Quad affecting Kashmir? Since we are in a KOA forum, how do you view it affecting Kashmir, and especially in political terms?
I think it's a recognition, most importantly, of India's emerging, growing power status, and the fact that you have these 4 countries. Usually in international politics, as you would know, Urvashi, you often come together only when there are common interests. Yes. But in this case, there are common values as well. Japan, Australia, India, and the United States are all democracies. All of them, except Japan, are also multicultural democracies. And all of them, except Japan, are also federal polities.
Yeah.
there is a lot that they bring to this coalition. Of course, I think the fact that you have a belligerent, aggressive, totalitarian, I could go on using adjectives which are not the most appealing adjectives for China, but that is because I see China as 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 really a counterpoint to everything that India
Stands for.
represents.
Yeah.
And that's why people who say, oh, why can't we act like China? I said, I hope we never act like China.
Yes.
Yeah. I hope the day doesn't come that we try and mimic China ever. Because I think the strength of India is, as I said, this disorderly, chaotic, democratic tradition, which might seem sometimes to be really shabby and soft and not very easy at decision making. And some people get tired, and some of you must have left because you faced all the problems that Indian democracy offers you. But it's getting better. Even as I spend time between Australia and India, and I see that it's easier. I'm talking to you from Jawaharlal Nehru University. I studied here before I went to England. There's no question when my parents had to send someone from my aunt's house if they had to send a message to me. And here I am talking to you on Zoom with a seamless internet connection, sitting with a suit in summer because there's a air conditioner. But I think these are signs of changing times. We are a much more articulate, robust country today. It's a country which I think has huge opportunities. The only thing that India often does is waste its opportunities. And I think there is a critical mass of people in India today who don't want to miss the bus this time. I think far too long we've missed that bus. This is one time that we can't afford to miss the bus because I don't know when the bus will come again. Here is an opportunity. Let's make the most of it. And along the way, you'll have challenges. You'll have challenges like communal relations. You'll have challenges like what's happening, the greatest humanitarian tragedy in Afghanistan. You'll have challenges within Kashmir. But after all, strong countries, great democracies overcome those challenges and emerge even stronger. I mean, after all, although I know there's a section of the KO which probably was supporting Trump, but I as a liberal supporter, believed in that Trump was far too individualistic and idiosyncratic a figure to be good for any democracy. But in America seems to have overcome the challenge posed by even Trump's right-wing supporters.
Yeah, I mean, on Trump, there was a diversity of opinion. I will admit that. Well, we share different opinions, I guess. But yeah, my husband also is a fan of your work and does believe that the Quad, if it's fully realized, it has the potential to replace even NATO as a premier liberal democratic alliance. Could be a bulwark against authoritarianism. So we will see. We will hope. I think we are just about time. So if you have any closing thoughts, would welcome.
There's some chat function which said, what was your relationship to PDP? And then it quotes an article of mine which says exactly what PDP was, an experiment where I think they were trying to reconcile the interests of Jammu and Kashmir. And I knew Mufti Said for a long time. He asked me when I came back from Australia, can I help him advise him on education primarily. I took that opportunity. Everyone should take an opportunity if you think you can make a difference. Unfortunately, I don't think I made a difference. I don't think I was cut out for politics. Normally, academics have an assumption of their own. There's a certain hubris which comes with academia. You think you are good at doing everything. I was not good at being a politician. Let me admit that. Secondly, about an interview where I said that 370, yes, the security situation is excellent. On the governance and the development front is exactly what I said. We haven't seen the opportunities, but that's why it's important for groups like the KO to come in. We can't always see the state as the great benefactor. After all, America was created by free marketeers. America was created by private individuals who were not looking at the state for doles constantly. That investment, those opportunities have to be taken on by people like us. So, Pavanji, I hope I have answered your questions. I'll be happy to answer. 370, I agree with you, is forgotten. The clock can't be turned back. Vijay Dhar, I don't know whether it's the same Vijay Dhar that I know. Thank you very much for your comments. And again, as I said, it's a deep honor to be here. In all humility, I see, uh, as I grow older and older, I see huge reservoir of strength socially, politically, intellectually from within the Kashmiri Pandit community, and especially, and not only, the diasporic community and the KOA. I think I see you as a way leading in some ways for the future.
Thank you, Amitabh.
Many thanks for your time, Dr. Mattu and everyone else. This has indeed been a privilege. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amitabh ji. It has honestly been a pleasure having you. It's a very interesting conversation. Obviously, people have many diverse thoughts on it and their own commentary on that. It would probably lead to a 3 or 4 hour conversation back and forth, but we unfortunately don't have time. But certainly, it's very insightful. And I would certainly take you up on those, the offer that you have for, opening your home to the internship program. That would indeed be a very important step forward for the cultural interaction and having the youth get introduced to the Kashmiri culture and the roots that we left back home.
Be a great honor and pleasure to work with you, ma'am.
Absolutely. The honor and privilege is all ours. It has really been a pleasure seeing you. Thank you.